Welcome back to the West Virginia Media Lab podcast.
Yeah.
I was reading the latest blog post on our site, and it just got me thinking about a story that's, well, it's just begging to be shared.
hmm
We're talking Prohibition-era, Fayette County, moonshine, dynamite.
Oh, yeah.
It's a wild one.
It really does capture that spirit of the time and place, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The 1920s, the Volstead Act outlawing alcohol production and sale, nationally. But in a place like Fayette County, with its deep-rooted moonshining traditions, that law, well, it might as well have been written on moonshine itself. It just wasn't going to stick.
Exactly. The blog post, it really paints this, vivid picture of Fayette County.
Yeah.
Rugged, independent, and with folks used to doing things their own way.
Mm-hmm.
And the landscape itself, the hollows,
Yeah.
the dense forests, those winding roads, it's perfect for hiding a still or two.
10.
Or 10, right.
Yeah, it's important to remember that for many in those hills, moonshining wasn't just like some illegal side hustle. It was a legacy.
Yeah.
Generations had honed the craft. It was a source of income and, frankly, a point of pride. Defiance against the government, it was baked right in.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of defiance, a culture clash brewing.
Yeah.
Enter our whiskey rebels.
Right.
I love that name, by the way.
Yeah.
It perfectly captures their attitude.
Mm.
The post doesn't give us their real names, but we know they were likely coal miners, maybe farmers, just, trying to make ends meet during a tough time.
Yeah, and it was a tough time. Many were struggling, and Prohibition, it only exacerbated the situation. Mining was dangerous. Farming wasn't always reliable. Moonshining offered a way to supplement their income, to provide for their families, to thumb their noses at a law that felt, I don't know, out of touch with their reality.
Then we have their rivals, the Holler Hooters, another great moniker.
Yeah.
They were cutting into the rebels' territory, and profits and tensions were running high. It seemed this wasn't just friendly competition. There was, real animosity there.
Yeah, this rivalry speaks to the economics of the situation. Prohibition, it created a black market, and with that came fierce competition. It wasn't just about, pride or tradition. It was about livelihoods.
Yeah.
These weren't big-time gangsters. These were folks trying to carve out a living in a harsh environment made even harsher by the law.
So what do the whiskey rebels do? They hatch a plan,
Mm.
and it involves dynamite. Not exactly subtle, right?
Not at all. And here's where it gets interesting. The blog post mentions that dynamite, well, it wasn't exactly a rare commodity in Fayette County, especially with all the mining operations. It was a tool, albeit a dangerous one, that was readily available.
Oh, I can just imagine the scene.
Mhm.
A bunch of guys huddled around a table, probably fueled by a little too much of their own product, deciding that blowing up their rivals still is the best course of action.
And that right there highlights a crucial element of this story. Alcohol, it wasn't just a product. It was often part of the process. These weren't like detached businessmen. They were living and working in a culture where moonshine was deeply ingrained. Their decision-making process, well, we can safely say it, was likely influenced by their own wares.
Which brings us to the strategic planning session. According to the blog post, these guys weren't exactly sober when they were cooking up this dynamite plot.
Right.
In fact, they were probably 3 sheets to the wind.
And that's where the comedy, but also the danger, really kicks in. We have this group of guys already prone to, impulsive behavior. Now add copious amounts of moonshine to the mix. It's a recipe for disaster, literally.
Okay, so picture this.
Yeah.
It's a moonlit night. The Holler Hooters still is tucked away in a hidden hollow, and our whiskey rebels are stumbling through the woods, loaded with dynamite and probably a few more jugs of moonshine for good measure.
Yeah. The post specifically mentions Junior, Clyde's right-hand man. He's the one tasked with planting the dynamite. But he's about as steady as a newborn fawn on roller skates.
Oh, no.
He's dropping the dynamite in mud, fumbling with the fuse. It's like watching, a slapstick routine unfold, but with very real, very explosive consequences.
And Clyde, the leader,
Mm-hmm.
is he, providing some steady guidance?
Not exactly. He's too busy arguing with Bubba, another member of this motley crew, about whether they brought enough moonshine. It's pure chaos.
But hold on, they're worried about bringing enough moonshine to blow up someone else's moonshine.
Right.
This is almost too good to be true.
It speaks volumes about their priorities, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But also perhaps about their naivete. They underestimated the danger, the volatile mix of alcohol and explosives.
So Junior's trying to light the fuse, but he's so drunk he accidentally sets his pants on fire.
Oh.
You can't make this stuff up.
And this is where things take a turn for the truly absurd.
I'm on the edge of my seat here. What happens next?
Well, they realize the dynamite's about to blow, and instead of hitting their target, it rolls downhill towards their own stash of moonshine. Talk about a major backfire.
No. You're kidding. They blew up their own moonshine. This is unbelievable.
It's a truly spectacular moment of self-sabotage. The blog post describes this huge fireball, shaking the whole hollow,
And all our hoochers still?
miraculously unharmed. Can you imagine their reaction?
Oh, I bet they were having a good chuckle about that one. But seriously, what were the consequences? Did anyone get arrested?
That's where things get a little fuzzy. The blog post suggests that the authorities might have, known about the incident, but given the prevalence of moonshining in the area and perhaps the sheer absurdity of the situation, they might have just turned a blind eye.
It makes you wonder what the real cost of this drunken dynamite disaster was. Was it the lost moonshine, the humiliation, or something else entirely?
That's a great question. It's easy to laugh at the story, but there were real consequences for these men, both in terms of their, livelihoods and their reputations. They might have become a local legend, but not necessarily the kind they'd hoped for.
So they became the laughingstock of Fayette County.
Most likely. And it probably fueled the rivalry even further. Imagine the stories being swapped in those general stores and coal towns. This incident would become, part of local lore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing moonshine and dynamite.
So where do we go from here? What else can we learn from this crazy story?
I think there's a lot more to unpack here. This isn't just, a funny anecdote. It's a window into a specific time and place, a reflection of cultural attitudes and economic realities.
It's a story that's both hilarious and thought-provoking, and I think it speaks to the larger themes we often explore here, on the podcast.
We've got prohibition, the clash between tradition and law, economic hardship, and of course the enduring appeal of a good story, especially one that involves a healthy dose of human folly and moonshine-fueled mayhem.
Sounds like we have a lot more ground to cover, so stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back after a quick break to delve deeper into the drunken dynamite disaster.
All right. As we were discussing the Whiskey Rebels' dynamite scheme before, it struck me that their choice of weapon wasn't just about availability. It also speaks to a certain mindset,
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Dynamite, it's loud, it's destructive, it's a statement. It's not a tool for subtlety. It's a tool for, making a point.
So you're saying it was more than just a means to an end. It was also, symbolic?
Exactly. They could have tried to sabotage the Holler Hoocher still in other ways, but they chose the most dramatic, most explosive option. It's almost like they wanted to send the message, like, we're here, we're not backing down, and we're not afraid to, make some noise.
That makes sense. It fits with that whole rebellious, independent spirit we were talking about earlier.
Right. And remember, the Volstead Act, it wasn't just like some abstract law to these folks. It was a direct threat to their way of life, their traditions, their livelihoods. So their response, even if misguided, was fueled by that sense of defiance.
It's like they were saying, if you're going to try to shut us down, we're going down with a bang.
And in a way, they did go down with a bang, just not the one they intended.
It's almost poetic, isn't it? Their own rebellious spirit, their own product, ultimately leading to their downfall.
There's definitely a certain irony there, and it speaks to the unintended consequences of prohibition. By trying to outlaw alcohol, the government, they inadvertently created this underground economy where violence and rivalry could thrive.
It's like they poured gasoline on an already smoldering fire.
Yes.
Fayette County was already known for its feuds and independent streak. And Prohibition just amplified those tendencies.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that this wasn't an isolated incident. There were other stories, other rivalries, other acts of violence fueled by the moonshine trade during this era.
So the Whiskey Rebels story, as outlandish as it seems, is actually representative of a larger trend.
Precisely. It's a microcosm of the challenges and complexities of Prohibition, particularly in rural communities like those in Appalachia. These were folks who were used to living on their own terms, and they weren't going to let a government mandate dictate their way of life.
Which brings us back to the Holler Hoochers. What do you think their reaction was to all of this? Were they truly intimidated by the Whiskey Rebels, or did they see them as more of a nuisance?
That's a great question. And one the blog post doesn't really answer, but I imagine there was a mix of emotions. On the one hand, they were likely, relieved that the rebels' plan backfired so spectacularly, but on the other hand, they were probably still wary. This incident, it likely intensified the rivalry, making things even more volatile.
It's like a game of cat and mouse, but with, dynamite and moonshine instead of cheese.
Exactly. And the stakes were high. This wasn't just about bragging rights. It was about control of a lucrative, albeit illegal, market.
It makes you wonder how this incident impacted the larger moonshine trade in Fayette County. Did it make things more dangerous, more competitive?
It's hard to say for sure, but it's certainly possible. This kind of event, it could have sent shockwaves through the community, making people even more wary of rivals and perhaps even more willing to resort to violence.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about, dates and facts. It's about real people, real conflicts, real consequences. And sometimes those consequences can be both hilarious and tragic at the same time.
Well said. And it's those human stories, those glimpses into the past that make history so compelling. We can learn about the Volstead Act and the impact of prohibition from textbooks, but it's through stories like the Drunken Dynamite disaster that we truly connect with the people who lived through those times.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of, historical events, even during times of social and economic upheaval, people are still people. They're capable of both brilliance and blunder, of bravery and foolishness, of making decisions that are both understandable and utterly baffling.
And it's those complexities, those contradictions that make the study of history so fascinating. It's not just a linear progression of events. It's a tapestry woven with countless individual stories, each thread contributing to the larger narrative.
I love that analogy. And I think the Whiskey Rebels story, as ridiculous as it might seem on the surface, is a perfect example of that. It's a story that's both specific to a time and place, yet it also speaks to, universal themes of human nature, rivalry, and the unintended consequences of our actions.
I agree. It's a story that can make us laugh, but it can also make us think. It can make us question our assumptions about the past and perhaps even about ourselves.
As we're talking about this, I can't help but wonder how this story has been, passed down through generations.
Yeah.
Did it become a local legend? Did the details get embellished over time?
It's certainly possible. Stories like this, they have a way of taking on a life of their own. They get told and retold, each retelling adding its own, layer of interpretation and embellishment.
It's a game of telephone, but with history.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes oral history so fascinating, but also so challenging. It's a living, breathing thing, constantly evolving and adapting as it's passed down through generations.
It makes you wonder what the true story really is, doesn't it? What actually happened that night in those, Fayette County hills?
That's the beauty and the frustration of history. We can, piece together the facts, we can analyze the evidence, but there's always an element of mystery, of interpretation. We can never truly know the full story, but that doesn't mean we can't try to understand it, to learn from it, to appreciate the layers of meaning that have accumulated over time.
And maybe that's the most important takeaway from the Drunken Dynamite disaster. It's a reminder that history is more than just a collection of, facts and figures. It's a collection of stories, each one offering a glimpse into the past, a chance to connect with the people who came before us, and perhaps even a chance to, learn something about ourselves.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to shift our focus a bit. We've talked a lot about the Whiskey Rebels and their misadventures, but I think it's important to remember that they were just one part of a much larger story.
You're right. We need to zoom out a bit to look at the broader context of Prohibition and its impact on West Virginia.
Exactly. So let's delve into that. How did Prohibition shape the social, economic, and cultural landscape of the Mountain State? What were the unintended consequences of this nationwide experiment? And how did the people of West Virginia, folks like the Whiskey Rebels and the Holler Hoochers, navigate this turbulent period in American history? We'll explore all of that and more after a quick break.
All right, so we've talked about the Whiskey Rebels, their rivals, their explosive misadventures, and the role of moonshine in all of this. But let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture. Prohibition, this grand experiment in social engineering. How did it really play out in a place like West Virginia?
Well, it is fascinating, isn't it? Because on paper, the Volstead Act, it was meant to curb alcohol consumption, nationwide.
Hmm.
But in a place like West Virginia, especially in those, rural, mountainous communities, it almost had the opposite effect.
It's almost like trying to dam a river, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You might redirect the flow, but the water's going to find a way. Right.
Exactly. And in West Virginia, that water was moonshine. It was already a part of the culture, a source of income, and in some ways a symbol of independence. Prohibition just pushed it further underground, making it more profitable and arguably more potent.
So it was a bit like a game of whack-a-mole. You try to stamp it out in one place, it pops up in another.
Precisely. And the blog post touches on this, mentioning that Fayette County was already known for its strong sense of, self-reliance. Folks were used to living off the land, to making their own way, and to, I don't know, distrusting outside authority.
So prohibition, instead of curbing drinking, might have actually fueled that rebellious spirit.
It certainly played a role by criminalizing something that was already, ingrained in the culture. The government inadvertently romanticized moonshining, turning it into a symbol of, resistance against an overreaching federal government.
Which makes me think about the whiskey rebels again.
Yeah.
Were they just bumbling fools? Or were they, in some, twisted way, folk heroes?
That's a thought-provoking question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. They were certainly operating outside the law, engaging in dangerous activities, but they were also products of their environment, reacting to a situation that felt imposed upon them.
It's that whole idea of unintended consequences again, right?
Absolutely. And it raises questions about the effectiveness of prohibition as a policy. Did it really achieve its intended goals? Or did it create more problems than it solved?
Well, considering the prohibition was eventually repealed, I think it's safe to say that it wasn't exactly a resounding success.
Right. And in the case of West Virginia, it seems to have, exacerbated existing tensions, fueled the underground economy, and perhaps even contributed to the violence that was already, a part of the landscape.
It's a reminder that history is rarely black and white. There are always shades of gray, complexities and perspectives that can shift depending on, who's telling the story.
And I think that's one of the reasons why the Drunken Dynamite disaster is such a compelling story. It's funny, it's absurd, but it forces us to think critically about a particular period in American history, about the choices people made and about the unintended consequences of those choices.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about human stories, about the lives of ordinary people trying to, make sense of their world, even if they sometimes do it in spectacularly foolish ways.
Exactly. And it's through those stories, those glimpses into the past, that we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
So as we wrap up this episode, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What can we learn from this wild tale of moonshine, dynamite, and the unintended consequences of prohibition?
I think there are several. First, it's a reminder that even the most well-intentioned policies can have, unintended and often negative consequences. Second, it highlights the importance of understanding the cultural and historical context of events. And finally, it reminds us that history is full of fascinating, often absurd stories that can teach us valuable lessons about, human nature, resilience, and the enduring power of a good laugh.
Well said. And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of Prohibition-era West Virginia. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of the Drunken Dynamite disaster and the larger themes that it represents.
We'll be back next time with another fascinating story from the Mountain State. So be sure to tune in. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering the hidden gems of West Virginia history.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. The West Virginia Media Lab is all about celebrating our state and its people, businesses, stories, news, and folklore. If you love West Virginia like we do, be sure to comment below, then subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell to stay connected. Until next time, stay wild, wonderful, West Virginia.